Greetings and welcome to the Richard Dolan Show, where every week we fight the good fight. I'm very glad to be here with you this day. For some time, I've been exploring an interest of my own. Some of you know I'm doing a fairly large book project on the subject of USOs, that is, Unidentified Submersible or Submersed Objects. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But another interest of mine, and I've been exploring this a lot on my website, particularly, occasionally on this channel, but definitely at my website, Richard Dolan Members, different thoughts on potential behaviors or intentions or even psychology of the intelligences behind the UFO, UAP phenomenon. That is, psychology of the aliens themselves. I've even explored thoughts on their potential social structure, even their politics to some extent. All of this is speculative, and obviously, you take it with a grain of salt. They're just my ideas. You can have your own ideas on this. But I've been wanting to explore this for some time. I just think it's one of these things where in the field of UFO research, UAP research, there's a couple of different ways that we want to go through this process. You want, on the one hand, to get as accurate data as possible in understanding the cases, knowing exactly what happened and all of that. And that's obviously critical. But I do think it's very useful, at least, to keep thinking about what is going on the other side of that phenomenon. In other words, who are these guys? What are their thoughts? Can we identify any consistencies in their behavior, in what appear to be intentions, and so on? If you go on the assumption that this phenomenon is fundamentally the result of an intelligence that is not our own, that is not from here, however we want to define that, then I think it behooves us to, at least from time to time, ask ourselves what we think is going on. And this is something that I like to do. I find it interesting. It's even a little bit fun at times to explore these matters. And the great thing is that I get to share this with members of my site who provide feedback very frequently, whether pro or con, but they're always engaged. It's a great community over there. Those of you who are on that site watching this, you know who you are, and I'm always very grateful for that. Really appreciate your feedback. I also appreciate feedback on this YouTube channel. And although I don't always reply directly to your comments, I do want you to know I read the comments as often as I can. And I do like to kind of keep on top of what you all think, as well as the members of my website, on the different ideas and things that I put out there. So with that said, I want to continue this exploration, but in the context of the research that I have been doing of late on USOs. I'm going to show you some data in a second. One thing I will just say, I do get asked more and more from people when this study will be done. And as you can imagine, I love answering that question. So at the beginning of this year, my expectation was that I might be able to get it done by May. Well, that obviously did not happen. And then I thought, maybe I can get it done by August. And then I realized I should just stop providing any kind of deadlines as to when this project will be done. It will be done. It's been in the home stretch for some time. And one of the main reasons why it has slowed down a little bit is because of some of the data that I'm about to show you. What I was persuaded to do during the springtime, in part on the advice of my wife and a few other folks, was to extract categories and data out of the 600 or so USO cases that I have collected. I've gotten these cases from a wide range of databases, 3 very large databases, and then a bunch of other sources, websites, books, and journals, and so on. So I've collected them from a pretty wide range of sources. I put them all together, and then really a small group of us talking decided I should just go through the process and extract relevant data out of these and see if there's anything that can be seen in it. So I'm going to show you my spreadsheet. I am not a spreadsheet guy. This was the first spreadsheet that I've actually ever done. And those of you who are pros at this will see, oh my God, he's maybe not necessarily all that good at this, but just to give you an idea. So I've got a little over 600 entries. I'll just scroll down to the bottom here. They're all listed chronologically, right up to 2024. And I'll just show you some of the categories that I've created. So I've got them by date, time. I just break that down between night and day. And there's a few cases where it's not clear, was this in the daytime or at nighttime? And if that's the case, I just put in unknown. But I thought it would be interesting to see whether or not I could find patterns. Body of water, I use a lot of my own shorthand here, but I know what these things mean. So ocean, IN is Indian Ocean, no surprise. Res, NA is a reservoir in North America, and so on. So I've got that. And then size of the object. And a lot of this is just estimate, I broke this down between small, medium, and large. Small is basically anything that's too small for a human being to get into. I call that small, medium, maybe a few people, up to about 50 feet diameter, and anything larger than that I call large. Color of the craft, pretty self-explanatory. A lot of unknowns, as you can see. Not all witnesses describe the color of a craft. Turns out. Who knew? Shape of the craft, similar. I've got them all different ones listed here. Sound, did this object make a sound or not? Was it luminous? What was its relationship to water? Did it emerge from the water? Was it below the water? Did it emerge and enter the water, and so forth? 5 observables is a category that you have people like Lou Elizondo, Chris Mellon, a lot of the old folks at TTSA, and ATIP, I believe, we're using this category. I think it's now 6 observables, but I just got 5. And the 5 observables are, sudden acceleration, transmedium capabilities, positive lift, no signature from hypersonic speeds, and what was the other one? Low observability. To varying degrees, those are relevant to some of these cases, and to some extent, they're not necessarily relevant. I have some categories of effects that I was able to glean from the various accounts. I created a one category just with EM effects because a lot of them are electromagnetic effects, about 49, 50 of them. Witnesses, I broke it down into just 3 categories. Was there one witness? Were there a small group of witnesses up to 10? And were there more than 10? And I try to keep it simple. But again, that's, I think, a relevant data point to have in front of you. Proximity of the witness to the object itself. I have close, medium, distant. Those mean something to me. They don't necessarily mean something to you. Anything up to 100 yards, I put close, medium up to about a mile, and then distant, basically anything more than that. Vantage point, where was the witness? Were they on the ocean? Were they at the shore? So forth. I have a category here I call potential interest in witness. It's definitely subjective by me. I read the case and I ask myself, does it look like there was any potential interest by the operators of these objects in the witness? And turns out, yeah, a lot of the cases there were about almost 40%. And then I just have additional category. A lot of this is filled up with just extra stuff. Was it a military case? If it's a U.S. military, I just put military. If it's the military of another nation, I'll designate. So military RU is Russia, and so forth. And then other things. Was there missing time? Yeah, there are missing time cases. Was there, anything else that's going on here? I just put in there. So that's my spreadsheet. And what I will say is that you will have access to that spreadsheet. So when my research is completely done, when I've got everything published, the spreadsheet will certainly be published within the context of my book, but I may make it available in other ways as well. I want people to have this. Look, it's not perfect. There's a lot of things that you could say against any of the data that's in there, undoubtedly. But what I will say is that in collecting the various cases over a period of about 2 years, I had a very simple criterion: was it a compelling case to me personally? Did I find it to be worthwhile? Was it supported by at least believable testimony and any supporting corroboration, if that's the case? A lot of these did not have the kind of corroboration that you really want, whether they're older or more recent cases. Fact is, a lot of these cases we know about, or I've learned about, because someone would write about it some years after the fact. They tell their story, and sometimes that's what you have to go on. There are many cases, however, where various researchers corresponded and communicated with the witness, sometimes at great length. And then there are some cases that became very publicly well known and were investigated even further than that. So you've got different variations and gradations of that. But essentially, when I was pulling cases out of all of the sources that I could find, really all that I can say is I used my best judgment, and I weeded out a lot of cases that could very well have been true, but that did not have enough for me to go on to decide, do I believe this or not? Some of the sightings that people report are pretty bare bones. There's not a lot to them. Others have more detail. So it goes. So out of all of the cases that I looked at, I included a little over 600 into this collection. And it's exciting. It's really interesting research. It's some of the most interesting research I have ever done, I must say. And, a number of times on this channel, I have discussed this with you. I've talked about USOs from time to time. So I'm going back at it again here because I've got some new things to say. Let me pull up. I've got some slides here, and I'm just going to run through the basic. This is like a bare bones statement of the data. I think I have about 11 conclusions here. So basic number of incidents, I've got about 600 cases, a little bit more than that, from various sources. The earliest case that I've collected is from 1717. About 95% of them are from 1942 onward. And I'll just talk about that for a second here. I think, there's a lot of folks who talk about ancient aliens, ancient UFO, USO sightings. I have looked for these cases in terms of USO, that is water-based activity. And there are a few potential outliers that do go back before 1717, but I will just say, and I'm not going to get into the whole detail of this here, but I don't find most of those early cases especially compelling or even credible. Doesn't mean that there were none. It's entirely possible that there were such cases. But when I look over those early cases, I just have to say there are very, very few to begin with that deal with water-based phenomenon in a way that we would call them USOs. And then of those, they don't cut it, in my opinion. So I'll just leave that there. I think that there are reasons for this. And one of the reasons is because of our own development as a species. I've talked about this many, many times now. And I do think that it was humanity's engagement with the scientific worldview and an industrial infrastructure that very likely, or at least it seems to me, triggered a very much higher level of interest by other intelligences in our society. So that's my current working theory on this, to explain why the vast, overwhelming bulk of good UFO, UAP sightings really stem from relatively modern times. There are some good 19th century cases that I do have in my forthcoming book. So it's not that there's nothing. And some of those cases are quite good in my view. So I've got them in there. Anyway, so that's point number one. Point number two is the scope of these incidents. It's really global. Now, the data is kind of dominated by United States, American reporting of it. That shouldn't really surprise anyone. The U.S. has had, I think, the biggest interest in this, and certainly has the best reporting infrastructure for UFO reports, I think, anywhere. I mean, in the English-speaking world particularly, if you see a UFO, you've got a number of pretty good options to report it. You've got MUFON. You've got the National UFO Reporting Center. Those two alone are massive databases that accept thousands of reports every year. And there really are no comparable systems for other languages and other nationalities. There are other researchers who collect these reports, and we do get them from other nations, so it's not a complete wash. But it is really, a lot of it is U.S. dominated. You just got to take it for what it is. But even having said all of that, it is very obvious that these cases are completely global. They involve every single major body of water on planet Earth and a lot of minor bodies of water as well. And that includes not just North America or Europe or South America, but it does include Africa. It includes Asia, and really all the places where people live and where there's bodies of water. Third, now this is, I think, now we're getting to some interesting stuff here. So in terms of USO behavior and capabilities, I'm going to argue here in this presentation that there are definite patterns in the data that I'm looking at and consistencies, and sometimes very like very particular kinds of consistencies that you wouldn't ordinarily expect to see, that suggest to me that these objects possess intentional behavior. And also, I mean, obviously technological capabilities far beyond our own, but the intentional behavior part, I think, is, again, very important to emphasize here. Those people, those of us who have studied the UFO or UAP phenomenon for any long period of time, I don't think you need a lot of convincing when it comes to, the question, are these beings and craft acting with some kind of definite intention? I think it's pretty evident to many people. But nonetheless, I do think it's useful to find other types of data points that support this, this notion. And I definitely do think that when we look over some of the very distinctive patterns with USOs, that we once again see very substantial support for the idea that this is intentional, and, as I'm going to suggest, probably adaptive behavior by these non-human intelligences, presumably, that are operating these very, very amazing craft that they have. So let me continue. I've got 11 points here. This is number 4, military connection. So I've got 20% of all of the cases I have collected, about 123 to be exact, involve one of the world's militaries. An overwhelming number of the cases that I've collected, 79%, involve the United States military, the U.S. Navy. I have actually 1 or 2 military cases that are not Navy. One is an Air Force, some Coast Guard cases. Mostly it's Navy. So simply to point out that a good chunk of the cases that I've found are military cases. I think that's interesting and noteworthy for a lot of reasons. When you talk about UFOs and national security, you definitely want to know, are there military connections? Well, turns out military connections to this phenomenon are very pronounced. So no surprise. Now, this is something that I think is noteworthy as well. Nighttime activity. I've been talking about this with folks on my website over the last few weeks, and I have come to feel that this is a very significant thing. I'll get into some of the statistics a little bit further into this presentation, but essentially what it looks like to me, and I'm just looking at USO data here, is that there appears to be a dramatic change toward overwhelming numbers of nighttime operations starting in the very late 1960s. Actually, 1968 is when it looks like it begins, and through the 1970s and to our own time. So whereas up until that period, up until the late 60s, USO encounters, at least the ones that I've been able to collect and tabulate here, had a slight majority of daytime sightings. I think it was like 52% up until the late 60s were in the daytime and 48% at night. So that's kind of what you would expect. I mean, Earth is at any given point 50% in daylight and 50% in darkness. So you might think, okay, well, that's about right, 50-50. Starting in the late 60s, it goes to 3/4 nighttime. And for military cases, and I'll come back to this, it's even more extreme. The amount of night, the percentage of military USO encounters that occur at night is absolutely overwhelming. So just an interesting thing. Again, I'll come back to that. Oh, yes, beings and missing time. So it is true that there are some USO cases that are associated with missing time and a few that are associated with sightings of, at least alleged sightings, let's say, of beings associated with the craft. When you add those together, it's about 6% of all of the cases I have. I think only 1 or 2 overlaps among those. So 1 or 2 cases where someone sees a being and reports missing time. Generally, they're separate, about 3% for each, roughly speaking. And again, I think that is significant. I'll have more to say about that in connection with a few other things, so stick around. Transmedium capabilities. 68% of all of the cases that I have found involve transmedium objects. That is an object that can operate with seemingly equal ease in the water or out of the water. To be clear, we do not yet have any vehicle that anyone is aware of that has genuine transmedium capabilities. There are some that can kind of go coast along the water surface and then take off. Yes, so we're getting there, but operating actually in the water, we don't have that. So a large number of these objects, I mean, a shockingly high number, 68% is a huge amount, much more than I would have expected when I started this research a little over 2 years ago. So that's an interesting thing. So then getting into the last of these initial points I want to mention, electromagnetic effects. So one of the things, if you notice, I did try to track effects in going through these cases, and EM effects were one of those. So to the best of my ability to track this, I've got about 49 cases of EM effects being reported by witnesses. It's about 8.5% of all the total cases. What was interesting, so an EM effect would be, you know, my battery got drained, or the lights went out, or our communications went down, or the engine stopped, or things like that. That's an EM effect. That's about 8.5% of all of them. But when you look at military cases, then that percentage goes up significantly. And in fact, when I compared military to non-military, it's just about double the likelihood that military witnesses will experience electromagnetic effects. Just about double. I think it's just under that. And then missing time cases. So in the 17 cases that I have where a witness believed or stated that they had lost some amount of time inexplicably, the likelihood of reporting EM effects was 4 times above the average. So I think that's kind of interesting. Witness proximity, thought this would be, oh, by the way, this image that you're looking at, this is an illustration for my book by my illustrator and friend and colleague, Alan Levine. Some of you remember Alan. I interviewed him multiple times here on this channel. Alan was an investigator for the organization APRO, that is the Anomalous Phenomena Reporting Organization, APRO. And he was very involved with that. And he's a great guy and a great illustrator. And he put this together for me. And I thought I would show that. This is one of the many illustrations he's made. And this is from a specific case. So these are not just random. Anyway, witness proximity. About half, 49% of all of the cases, to the best of my ability to determine this, let me just make that caveat, occurred within 100 yards of the witness. It's pretty close. And nearly 3/4, I think 73% of all the cases involve multiple witnesses. So just thought I'd put that out there. I think that goes at least somewhat toward giving us some level of confidence in what these witnesses are reporting. A little thing about triangular USOs. Now, the USOs come in a variety of shapes. You've got disc-shaped ones. You've got these spheres, like indicated on this image here. There are a few that are cube-shaped, box-shaped, that type of thing. There are some that are just identified only as a light. People could not see anything beyond that. Just, I saw this bright light, and that's all you have. But a few of them, 23 actually of the cases that I have, involve a definite description of an object that is triangular. So it's a small minority of cases. What's interesting about that is that geographically, this is the only type of USO that appears to be very geographically restricted. The cases that I have, all but two, and those two I consider a little bit of outliers, and I'm not I don't know what to say about them. I don't think they're bad cases, but they're outliers. But all of the others involve these objects appearing within U.S. or Canadian waters. Now, I'm adding in the Caribbean Sea because a number of them have been in the Caribbean. But that's a U.S.-dominated body of water, and I think it's relevant. But a lot of U.S. and Canadian lakes. Another thing about those triangles, they have a much higher percentage of freshwater activity than any of the others. I think 43% of all of my triangular cases involve bodies of fresh water. That's much higher than the average, which is about 25%. So they're a little bit higher than the average, if that means anything. It's kind of a small data sample. Maybe it doesn't mean anything, but I just thought I would mention it. But they do seem to be restricted to primarily U.S.-dominated waters. And then the last data point I'm going to talk about here for the moment is the decade of the 1970s. I actually did a presentation on this from my website just the other day. And what's interesting about that in terms of this phenomenon is how USO sightings just seem to explode in that decade. And in fact, to this day, that is the by far the most active decade for USO sightings of all of them. What's kind of interesting about that is that, that was before internet. And yet we have this overwhelming number of cases. In fact, I have a chart that I'll show you in a short while that highlights that even more. But essentially, the number of cases for that decade were very, very high. And a number of other things about that decade were quite interesting. I mean, I'll just mention here, the percentage of electromagnetic interference cases during the 70s was double that of the norm. And I mean, that is in the ratio. So the decade already had the most number of USO cases by a very large margin, but it also had by far the largest percentage of EM cases. So where people reported interference in some way or another. And then that's the first decade as well in which you have a very strong predominance of nighttime sightings. So I just want to leave you with that for the moment. I want to do a very, I want to switch gears slightly. I think you'll see where I'm going. And I want to make the case, or at least the suggestion, that when we are dealing with this phenomenon, whether it's USOs or UAP anywhere else, that we appear to be dealing with a non-human intelligence. At least that's what it looks like to many of us who study this. And therefore, we want to find out whether or not we can see patterns in their behavior and perhaps even them adapting to us. I think this seems to be done far, not often enough. So we're going to do it here. The first thing I'm going to do here is just walk you through about a very quick walkthrough of about 150 years of our own oceanographic history, to give you an idea of how dramatic humanity's exploration of the oceans has been since that time, since the 1870s until today. This is an illustration of the HMS Challenger from the 1870s, and this is a very important ship. This was the first ship to really do a systematic conducting of Earth's bodies of water in a kind of scientific way, where they were studying marine life and they were trying to measure the depths of various parts of the waters to the extent that they were able to do, and just a massive data collection to the point where this is considered, this expedition, to be the foundation of modern oceanography. So now, when you look at the technology that they had available to them at the time, it's very, very, very primitive by our standards today. But I wondered about this, and if there was an alien or non-human presence in our waters back at that time, and I do think that is very possibly the case. Yes, that is what it looks like to me. Then we can ask ourselves, how would a non-human intelligence perceive humanity's early oceanic exploration? Well, if you're just looking at the Challenger here, very likely, I think they would consider it fairly non-threatening. But it's also possible that they might be thinking, let's keep an eye on these people. Particularly so if they have a good understanding, which they probably would, of the likely trajectory of our own science. Assuming that they themselves are very scientific, we might presume that they would have a pretty good understanding of where we would be heading over the next several generations. So it could be an attitude of, we have nothing to worry about right now. We can do whatever we're doing, but we got to keep an eye on these people. And I think that's at least a speculative possibility. So one generation after the Challenger, you have another milestone. This is the world's first really operational submarine called the USS Holland, and it debuted in 1900. Really interesting piece of technology, as I've learned. It used a diesel engine and a battery to do what it did, so that when it was close to the surface or at the surface, it would have the diesel engine in operation, and it would just move on that basis. That engine would power or charge the battery, and so when it was time to submerge, it would switch off the diesel engine and run on battery power. And then when it ran low on battery, it would surface, run on the diesel, charge it up again, and do that. And then you can see a picture of it there. It's very impressive for its time. You can see that this is landmark technology here. And again, it's one of those things where if you're trying to speculate as to how a non-human presence would perceive this, again, they might be thinking, oh, okay, they're getting a little bit more advanced here. Really nothing to worry about. This is still totally non-threatening to them. But it wouldn't be the case indefinitely. Another generation or almost a generation later, you've got the First World War, and we start using echolocation or the beginnings of kind of sonar to determine acoustic patterns inside large bodies of water. You can see this is a man doing just that. This is around the time of World War I. And again, by standards of today, this is primitive, but definitely a leap forward compared with previously, when there was no capability whatsoever. This was used during the war to detect enemy submarines, no surprise. And it was also used by submarines to detect icebergs and other obstacles in the water that they would have to worry about. I don't know how effective this was at the time, but it had to be somewhat effective or they would not have used it. Another leap forward, you move to the Second World War, and now things just really go crazy. You've got aircraft carriers, particularly of the United States, just patrolling all of the world's oceans, especially the Pacific at that time. And you've got the development of radar, which you're looking at here on the right of your screen, and sonar, to very far more sophisticated degrees, on top of which you get the detonation of the first atomic bomb, of course, and a whole array of other weapons and technologies that our species developed during that Second World War, that absolutely monumental war in which so much changed and left such a footprint, not only in terms of its destructiveness on the planet and on human civilization, but on our ability to master the various environments of the world, air, and the oceans, both. I mean, we just had massive strides during that period of time. And it is during the Second World War, of course, as many students know, that we start really seeing a significant upgrading of the number of what were called Foo Fighters originally, and then flying saucers, and then UFOs, and now UAP. We see a massive explosion of these sightings. And, it's, again, not that there are not there were not some very interesting sightings prior to World War II. There were. But when you are looking at the sum total, there is no comparison. So things really start going off the charts, starting with the Second World War, and they have continued that way to this day. I'll just continue a little bit more of some of these other technological developments. So we have the first nuclear powered submarine in 1954, the USS Nautilus, very famous. That's a nice little illustration there. A very impressive submarine indeed. So nuclear powered submarines had so many advantages over their predecessors. They were very quiet. They could operate for extremely long periods under the water. They were just a massive leap forward in submarine technology. Also, during the decade of the 1950s, you begin the appearance of what's called the Sound Surveillance System, or SOSUS. It goes by different names now, and other nations have done this as well. So Britain has their own version, Russia has its own version, China has their version. But what it involved, starting in the 1950s, is placing of sensors, acoustic sensors, on the ocean. In fact, on this inset on the right is one such sensor that washed up on a beach, I think in Iceland, and that's kind of what it looks like. But essentially, this would be on the bottom of the ocean, or on maybe along in the shallows. Be easy to get it down there, and connected by acoustic fiber optics nowadays, but connected electronically to listening stations where these things would pick up acoustic signals. So it was our attempt to determine, like, where are there enemy submarines and all of this type of thing, basically monitoring ocean traffic. This system is very widespread, excuse me, in the world today. I don't know that it is absolutely comprehensive throughout the world, but it is in many, many parts of the world's oceans. It's quite extensive. So there's that. That started in the 1950s. And now you got to start thinking, if you're a non-human intelligence, again, operating in the waters, you might be thinking, okay, this is starting to get a little invasive. we really need to think, how are we going to deal with this? And, the human exploits just continued. 1960, we sent a bathyscaphe down to the bottom of the world's deepest trench, the Marianas Trench, almost 7 miles down in the Pacific Ocean. There's an achievement for you. At the same time, of course, that we were just exploring space for the first time. We're also exploring the great depths of the ocean. So it was becoming clear that there was, in theory, no part of the ocean that humanity could not reach if it desired. By the 1960s, we actually had remotely operated vehicles, ROVs. This one in 1966, this is an illustration, actually was able to retrieve an unexploded nuclear ordnance off the coast of Spain. So there it is, and you can see it's connected by a tether at the top there. That's how these are operated. They still are this way. So you have a human operator on top of a surface ship controlling this object, and they were actually able to use it to grab onto this bomb and to retrieve it using an ROV. That's in 1966. Again, very impressive. During the 1970s, we see a real explosion of satellite technology. That's not ocean-based, but it is definitely, the first satellite, of course, first man-made satellite we have from 1957. The 1960s were really the decade where you start seeing the satellite system coming into place. By the 70s, it was pretty good. It was pretty extensive. You start getting a lot of commercial satellites, communication satellites for the general public during the 1970s. During that decade also, you get the conception and actually the initial implementation of GPS, the global positioning system for satellites. And again, it's not ocean-based, but it's intrusive, and it's another of these things where, again, if you've got a non-human intelligence that appears in large numbers during the 1940s, where there were no satellites, there were no deep ocean ROVs, and there were none of that, and then suddenly within one generation, essentially, we've got all of this stuff out there. That seems to me would be something that they would have to deal with, or at least be cognizant of. As time goes by, the 1980s and 90s, you start getting much more sophisticated underwater vehicles. This is called an autonomous underwater vehicle. This is a type of unmanned underwater vehicle. Not all UUVs are autonomous, but a lot are, and they're pretty good. This is the recently publicized manta ray UUV. You may have seen this in the news during the last year. So in just 150 years from the HMS Challenger in the 1870s to today, that's 6 generations of humanity. It's not that much. We have made an incredible leaps and bounds, advancements in our ability to engage with Earth's massive oceans and large bodies of water to a degree that I'm sure would have shocked anyone in the 1870s. And it's really kind of amazing when you think about it even today. So that's a little bit of a backdrop. Now I want to continue on with some of the USO data that I have here. When I put this graph together, I don't know when I did, about a month ago, just tracking the USO cases by decade. The numbers here can be adjusted. I actually have 615 total cases, but I eliminated some of these for statistical purposes. I don't want to get into all the reasons for it, but I've got my reasons. Needless to say, this is essentially what we are looking at. So you've got pre-1942, the first column there. It's kind of large because it's a conglomeration of a whole bunch of decades, obviously. If you took any one of the decades on its own, they would be very, very tiny. And then you start seeing an uptick in the 1940s, and it grows. Take a look at the 1970s here, and it's overwhelmingly larger. The 2010s is the second most active decade for this. So that's interesting. The 2020s, which we are still in, obviously we're not even halfway through it. And also it must be said, the amount of data I fully expect for the 2020s will continue to come in. A lot of these cases, they are reported a number of years after the fact. That's just how it is. So I fully expect that we'll be seeing more and more cases from the 2020s come in as the years, and even as the decades go by. I'm sure in the 2030s, someone will write into some blog site about their experience in the 2020s. And then if I'm still doing the research on this, I can put that into the total. So, but here you can get a pretty good idea of it. So it's actually fairly, once you get to the 1960s, the numbers are kind of consistent other than the 70s, which is really just jumping out above all of them. You're looking at roughly 70 or so cases per decade, give or take. Now, these are 70 cases of USOs that I have found. Let's just keep that in mind. I mean, as with normal UAP or UFO sightings, the vast majority of sightings never get reported. And with USOs, they are definitely a small subset of the overall UAP phenomenon. I've sometimes heard people say that 50% of all UFO sightings take place over bodies of water or have something to do with water. I don't know if I heard this from Ivan T. Sanderson initially. I'm not sure where that came from. I've heard it a lot. I don't really think much of that statement. Definitely when you're getting into USOs specifically, genuinely water-based phenomenon, they are an outlier among the large number of UAP reports. I think, in large part, it's simply because we live on land and most of us are not out in the oceans. If you live on the shore, you're going to be much, much more likely to see these things. So that does tell me there's a good likelihood that there's a fair amount of activity, when you go out into the oceans, but if there's no one to see it, there's no one to record it. And so, so there's a number of reasons I think why USO sightings compared to UFO sightings are so small. You go to the National UFO Reporting Center and you're getting a good 5,000 reports, raw reports every single year. Every year. I've collected about 600 USO reports covering a couple of hundred years. So that should tell us that, yes, I'm sure there are more than what I've collected, but they are a minority of cases. But let's go into some of the other data. So keep the 1970s in mind there. These are not very attractive charts. I actually just screenshot of them from my manuscript. So, but they get the job done. So I want to look at the day versus night breakdown, as I mentioned this before. So from 1942, and I'm starting it there. I'm leaving out the earlier cases for the day versus night comparison because there's not that many of them, and I really wanted to start with the modern era. So from 1942 to 1967, you have 48% of all USO cases occurring at night. After 1968, that number goes to 74%. So that's very significant. It almost felt like someone flipped a switch. But it's even more interesting when you break down military versus non-military USO cases. So for the non-military, in the early years from 1942 to 1967, civilian sightings accounted 43% of them took place at night. 57% took place during the daytime. So that's actually a much more substantial majority. Still not overwhelming, but it's notable. The military cases, even back then, were in a 2/3 majority occurring at night. About 64% occurred at night. And then when you go forward to past 1968, the civilian cases, they become predominantly at night, 71%, quite significant. I mean, that's jumping nearly 30%. It's quite a lot. Military cases go to 87% occurring at night. That's nearly a 9-to-1 ratio. Now, good, you can say data is incomplete, which I would agree with. The data may be unreliable, which is probably the case with some of that data. We can't know for sure if everything is exactly accurate, but it's a very definite pattern here. And again, I would emphasize that when I was collecting these cases, I wasn't looking for day versus night breakdowns. I wasn't looking for, was there anything unusual in terms of effects or this or that? I was just pulling in cases that looked like that seemed credible to me. That's really what it came down to. And that's what you get. I was actually quite surprised when I saw this 87% figure. That is, to me, that's a pattern, and that signifies intent. That signifies, for whatever reason, that the operators of these craft are able to distinguish between military and non-military ocean-based craft, which, why should that surprise us? But again, it does appear that the data bears this out. The data does seem to indicate that the operators of these craft are recognizing differences between military and non-military, and also choosing, it seems to me, to appear or to operate in the presence of people more and more at night as opposed to daylight hours, which had been the case prior to the 1970s. And then let's look at some electromagnetic cases by decade. I mentioned how the 1970s were kind of off the charts with EM cases, and this is a breakdown of that. So I'll explain this a little bit. So the column on the left is the number of total EM cases that I was able to find for each decade. And you can see the 1970s has by far more EM cases than any other decade. Now, part of that is because the 1970s had more cases. So there's that. But then when I looked at the percentage of EM cases in each decade, as I mentioned before, the average was about 8.5%. You see the 1970s is at 16.8%. And that means of all of their roughly 120 cases of USOs that I found for that decade, 16.8% of them had EM effects. That is, someone reporting communications went down, engine died, or some things like that. So the next column, I just have percent of the norm, the percentage of what you would expect. So the 1970s was 193%, nearly double what one would expect statistically if they just had an average amount of cases. So something weird was going on in the 1970s. It really makes me wonder what the heck was it? And I speculated a little bit about this on my site the other day, but I don't know that I have the answer. One of the reasons is that I wanted to show you a little bit of a history of our technological development is to give an idea, or at least to plant the seed that perhaps elements of our own development triggered a reaction in these other beings, if it's one group or multiple groups, whatever. So there's that chart. And I think I have one more chart here to share with you. Again, this is a simple little table. It doesn't look all that pretty, but gets the job done. So I looked at EM cases, electromagnetic interference cases, in conjunction with sightings of beings, in conjunction with missing time, in conjunction with the military, which I just talked about, and in conjunction with a category that I created called potential interest in witness, which I mentioned earlier. So when you look at all of those, so these are the number of cases in the left column where, so there were 3 of all the sightings of beings, 3 of them indicated electromagnetic interference. Of all the cases of missing time, 6 of them did. And military cases of 123, 16 of them did, and so forth. So the next column after that is, how did I break this down? The percentage of total EM cases. So, so if you look at the bottom row here, potential interest, 67% of all EM cases seem to me that the object showed some kind of potential interest in the witness. Again, that's a subjective criterion, but take it for what it's worth. About a full third of the military cases, a full third of the EM cases were military connected. 12% of the missing time cases, 12% of the EM cases, had missing time, and so on. So all of these are way higher than the norm should be by the amount, by the number of these cases. So like, you've got 17 cases of missing time. There should not be 6 of them that had electromagnetic interference. And so that's actually a little over 400% of what the norm should be. If you had a sighting of a being, you were a bit higher than the norm to experience missing time. Military also. With the military, again, this is against the entire data set. So I should have taken out all of the military cases. How do I say this? To compare military to non-military would have been better. What I'm doing is I'm comparing military to the total number of cases, which includes military. So I probably should have taken them out. But, for our purposes here, you can see that these, because that percentage would be higher. But you can see that there are definite connections there are definite patterns, I guess I should say, in these cases that seem to indicate intentionality, that seem to indicate that these operators of these craft, they know what they're doing. They have a definite plans or definite behaviors that they are engaging in that seem very intentional from their point of view. Now, it could very well be that we won't be able to figure out what all of those intentions are. It's possible. We might be able to speculate on a lot of them. Certainly, the emphasis on military encounters should tell us that those operators can identify military vessels and are interested in them. Why should that be surprising? Particularly if you have a military vessel that's got nuclear ordnance on it, or even is nuclear powered. That could be quite interesting to any observing intelligence. Of course it would. Missing time cases, you would expect, if you believe missing time cases, you would expect, strange effects like EM interference, probably, right? More than the norm. And indeed, we get that. Again, I can say when I was collecting these cases, I had no expectation that anything like that would turn up in the data. It was really quite a consistent pattern. So there's much more to explore in terms of all of this data. I'm not done looking at all of it, but what I definitely wanted to convey to you is that this data does seem to mean something. And in fact, the consistency and the patterns that I am seeing kind of give me a little bit more confidence that the data that the information provided by these many, many witnesses is probably accurate. And I think that's the case with most UFO reports. It's easy for people to kind of dismiss a raw report that's not investigated, saying, well, you can't prove it, that has happened. We all understand that. But the practical matter is that nearly all of sightings by people are very difficult to investigate more than a fraction of them. Like for an outside independent body to actually do a proper investigation of a UFO sighting is not that easy, and particularly to do a large number of them. So this is just what we're stuck with. We're stuck with large amounts of testimony. If someone wants to be an absolute stickler for hard, solid data, they can just choose to throw all of that information, all that testimony out. I personally think that's foolish, and I think it's actually in the broader sense, it's unscientific. I mean, proper science is always going to be very targeted and always going to want to be objective and focused on factual data. But in the broader sense, philosophically, to talk about science, which is to search for relevant information that is meaningful relating to a particular subject, I don't think that we're wise to discard the massive amounts of witness testimony to these types of cases. And if you do, which I have done thousands of times now, read through a detailed sightings report, whether it's of a aerial object or a water-based object, doesn't matter. You just read through them. What you find is that the vast majority of these witnesses are doing their level best to explain as well as they can some inexplicable thing that they saw or experienced. And so that's what we have. That's what we have to work with. So I think, back to the idea of alien behavior, alien adaptability, if we look at something like the decade of the 1970s, when you go back through the UFO history for the 1970s, this is something that I think is sometimes forgotten by more casual students of this phenomenon. And even some researchers may not really remember this, but the 70s were an incredibly active time for UFO sightings during that decade. A massive wave of sightings in the U.S. in 1973, another massive wave in 1975, going into 1976. 1975 was the year of Travis Walton's abduction case and other very high-profile abduction cases. You have the appearance of large numbers of cattle mutilation cases, mystery helicopters, and overflights over United States military bases during the latter part of 1975. Some incredibly dramatic cases that you could make a movie out of a number of those. In fact, they're incredibly dramatic. That continued into 1976. A lot of activity. Worldwide, the 1970s were a huge decade for UFO sightings, well beyond the United States. And a lot of those sightings, incidentally, were of what researchers would call high strangeness. That is, sightings of alleged beings were very, very high level, many large quantities during the decade of the 1970s. So much so that one researcher, Ted Blocher, I believe, wrote a book called 1973, The Year of the Humanoid. Back in the 70s, researchers would often say humanoid as opposed to alien or whatever. But there were many sightings that year. And then in 1978 was another huge year of this around the world. So the 70s were a happening decade in terms of sightings. And again, there was no internet. There was no internet for people just to easily report what they saw. I mean, I really wonder how big that decade would have been in terms of sightings if there had been an internet at that time. But even so, there was a lot happening. Many of the cases of the USO cases that I have found were submitted to the internet, of course, many decades later after the fact. But that's interesting too. You have all these people, they could have written about the 1960s and 1980s. And many of them did, but many more wrote about their experience in the 1970s. Now, maybe if we had access to a much more comprehensive database, we might see other patterns. Very likely. It's totally possible. But all I can do is give you what I've got here. And this is the best data that I've been able to amass. And this is what it looks like. So something happened. I guess what I'm going to suggest, this is my parting suggestion, is something appears to have happened during the end of the 1960s through the 1970s. A change of behavior in terms of switching from 50-50 day versus night to very strong emphasis on nighttime encounters. A very high, albeit temporary, emphasis on electromagnetic effects during the 1970s. What else did I have in there? Any of the other effects from the 1970s? A high percentage of EM, just a massive number of sightings. Just a massive number of sightings in the 70s. Something seems to have happened here. And I'd like to know what it was. Short of breaking into some classified holding or speaking with these beings themselves, I don't know if we will really know for sure. All we can do here is speculate. But I do wonder if some of this was a reaction, a change in behavior to deal, perhaps, with human technological advances. And could it be that EM interference or jamming in one form or another was a defensive measure that they were taking, at least temporarily? Are there secret histories here that we don't know about? Did the United States Navy undertake certain measures to harden their own vulnerability to EM interference? I don't know. I don't know the answers to that. Maybe with much more research, we can get some more answers. But the main point is these beings seem to be dealing with us with intentional and intelligent, adaptive, maybe even reactive behavior. They've got their own goals. They must, or they would not be here in the large numbers that this certainly appears to be. So them being here is important for them. That indicates that they have their own goals and their own mission, you could say. But it also indicates to me the potential that they perceive the need to adapt to us. Where this is all going in the future is a really good question to ask. I mean, we've got increasingly just better and better ability to detect all kinds of things in the world's oceans. And it's worth asking, even to speculate, how might that affect their behavior moving forward? Well, with that, I'll leave you to ponder these little mysteries. They are very interesting. In terms of, again, my research, I'll publish it as soon as I'm able to publish it. And when it happens, it happens. But believe me, I want to get this done more than anybody else. But I'm also not going to rush this in order to get it done by a certain time. I want this to be as good as I can make it. So I'm sure you understand that. Fascinating stuff. I'm sure I will come back to this again. I do a lot of this over at my website, Richard Dolan Members. Yeah, this is a plug for my website, but look, give me that. We've got a great community over there. Lots of amazing, brilliant people who have their own comments all the time on all the stuff that I put up there. But I'm definitely interested in your thoughts here. So let me know. I will be reading your comments. I'm looking forward to that. And until the next time, let's all keep fighting the good fight. I'll be back again. Catch you all again later. Bye for now. Oh, let me just say, if you like this video, hit the like button, share, leave a comment, all of that stuff. I'm terrible at remembering this, but anyway, I just mentioned that. And I'll catch you all again in the future. Bye for now.